What's your favorite city in your country? If you could recommend only one city in your country to a fellow traveler, which would it be? I'll start. I'm originally from Malaysia and my favorite city there is, without a doubt, Penang. I might be biased because I spent a lot of time there growing up, but it's got such a nice energy to it. It's the perfect blend of modernity and colonial charm, and there's a rush there that just fills me with life whenever I go back. I now live in the UK, and my favorite city here is probably Liverpool. It's not as hectic as other big bustling metropolises like London, Manchester, and Birmingham. It's also very compact, which is perfect for avid walkers like myself. There are so many trendy pockets in and around the city, and I love that I can still discover something or somewhere new every time I go. It never gets old. You? Asterisk. Best city in my country? Huh. That's a tricky one, but I have to go with Singapore. Coincidentally, I think it's also the worst city and the most average one. Why? Are you from the future? Lol. Vivacity emo. I am Singaporean and was about to comment the same thing. Favorite area? Region maybe Sengkang. Punggol. For some reason have always enjoyed those. Have great memories at Tampines too. Singapore is my favorite city in Malaysia. Yes. My favorite place in the world is your bird park. Personally, I prefer Singapore, but to each their own. Nice. Montreal is up there for me. A fusion of cultures, tastes, and language. Varied terrain with good transit and even better biking infrastructure. Picturesque but still full of dynamic energy. I'd highly recommend it to anyone. Montreal 100%. Victoria, BC is a worthy mention for Canada. Hippie culture and cool vibes all round. Too bad about the shitty locals though. 100% of the decent people in Victoria, my home too, are from somewhere else, and get shit on for that. Victoria is a beautiful, cliquey, entitled NIMBY wasteland full of adult children and main characters. You don't even feel you're in Canada or Anglo-North America. It's not surprising that so many Quebecers feel they are Quebecers and not Canadians. A lot of Canadians get angry at this for some reason. But aside from the language and culture, which are already major points, there are so many things that are different in Quebec, and reading the news about the rest of the country feels like they're talking of another country. So many shows and movies are filmed in Toronto or Vancouver as a stand-in for a generic American city. It's hard to tell the differ. NCE. I feel more Canadian in Montreal than Toronto. TBF, even with all the separatism, Quebec has perhaps had the most impact Canada's identity as a whole. Probably in the same way Bavaria is overrepresented in the overall German identity, or Jalisco, in Mexico. In my experience, most of Anglo-Canada feels like America light. Montreal and Quebec City felt more foreign to me. I'd mostly agree with that, but there's something different about parts of the East Coast. Newfoundland in particular doesn't feel like the US to me. Maybe I'm biased because I'm from the East Coast originally, but I've also lived in Ontario and out west, as well as in the US. Parts of Newfoundland were so ruggedly beautiful. Seeing moose, icebergs, the mountains, puffins and houses painted every sort of color felt like another country. So true. I guess it depends on what make you feel foreign. Southern Ontario? I feel like I'm in the US. Montreal, French Canada, and more, with an effortlessly cool vibe. I guess it helps if you speak French, but maybe it's from an historical perspective. I feel more connected to Canada in Montreal than somewhere like Windsor. No offense, Windsor. Detroit is awesome. Canada is America light without Quebec LMAO. The Maritimes, Newfoundland and the North are pretty distinct too. But yes, Central Western Anglo-Canada is US light. It definitely says something about Canada if the best city in the country feels like you're in another country. Montreal for sure. No other city in Canada comes close for culture and city vibe. Just don't plan on driving anywhere on the island if you value your sanity. And why would you want to anyway? Wait, why? It's so cold in the winter and I drive almost everywhere greater than 20 minutes walk away. I used to hate driving in Montreal when I was younger, but that was due to inexperience driving in any sort of big city. The few times I went for a conference or to see a concert, I used to park outside the city in Longueuil, then take the subway to get in. Now I could not care less. As a tourist, you can find good cheap parking downtown where to leave your car for the weekend and use public transit. In fact, most of the stress comes from watching your car shake itself to pieces from the potholes. Fun story. We took an Uber once in Montreal and the driver had recently immigrated from Afghanistan. He told us how much he loves being in Canada, how nice Canadians are, etc. So we asked if there was anything he missed from Kabul. Yes, he told us. The good roads. Vancouver is great for the weather, food, and scenery. But the massive influencer wannabe and corporate types kind of ruined it a bit and have made it unaffordable. Montreal is still affordable and has a nice laid-back vibe. I personally prefer Four Seasons, but Vancouver is pretty nice. Just more boring than Montreal emo. I am in the process of moving to Vancouver. It's both pretty and boring, as you rightly said. I'd love to visit Montreal, but I don't speak French. Should that be a challenge? It'll be a minor inconvenience, but definitely not a showstopper. You'll have a great time. That's great then, we'll plan a trip this summer, smiley face. For outdoor activities, like skiing, hiking, climbing, or mountain biking, Vancouver is arguably the best city in the world. There aren't too many places where you can ski and golf, sail on the same day. It doesn't hold a candle to Montreal for culture or nightlife, that's for sure. Vancouver is lovely to visit, but Montreal simply has more culture, food, and things to do. Vancouver's events culture can't hold a candle to Montreal's, and for some reason it feels even cheesier than it is because everything is grossly monetized. Vancouver is both overrated and appropriately rated at the same time. It's beautiful and awesome to visit, but it's expensive and the vibe has changed a lot recently. Montreal in the summer. Heavenly. As a Montrealer, when I travel and people ask me where I am from, I just can't say Canada. Doesn't come to me naturally. I wouldn't live there. I don't like very large cities, but it would be my recommendation as well. The vibe in late spring and summer is very nice. I find it's not something you get in places where the weather is nice the whole year around. We went to a restaurant there. Turned out it was cash only. We didn't have enough on us to cover the meal, and they said, "Oh, that's okay." Such nice people up there. I am staying in Montreal in June for my 30th birthday. Do you have any recommendations for things to do, places to visit, restaurants to try? I agree with you on Penang. As for my country, quite difficult. Italy has a lot of great cities to visit. I love my own city, Palermo, and I also love Naples. Florence is beautiful too, and there are some fantastic smaller cities too, like Lecce, Lucca, Orvieto, Ravenna, etc. But overall, for a first-time visitor, I'd have to go with Rome. Rome is a great world city. Anyone at all interested in history and Western civilization can't miss it. I agree, Rome is just so captivating, but I also love Palermo. Sicily, in general, is stunning. You're lucky to live in such a beautiful country. I'm jealous. Palermo is amazing. Fantastic energy, food, architecture, and setting. The food. I want to go back to Palermo just to eat arancini at Capal. Lol. Brilliant name for an arancine restaurant. Tears of joy for me. It would be the gelato. If you go to Palermo, it's arancine. Aranciniere for the heathens on the other side of the island, winking face. Can I at least get some credit for using the correct plural form? Eyes. Agree on Rome. The first time I arrived in Rome, I was like, you guys put this shit out in the sun and rain? In any other country in the world, it will be in a glass box in a museum. Half of the city seems to be built with recycled ancient Roman bricks, columns, etc. It's pretty amazing. Going to Rome and Venice, Florence, etc. Later this year, excited to visit. I'm keeping the south of your country for another future trip. It's crazy how iconic Italy is. Very few country has as many known cities and regions to us North Americans. I feel like I could spend a couple months just hitting touristic hotspots. Annecy, France. Annecy is stupid beautiful, a must-see. And the lake just next to is stunning. Annecy is so beautiful. Never seen a lake so crystal clear. Yes, Annecy is so beautiful. My 9-year-old declared she needed to move there. I know so many people in my country think this place is just riddled with crime, but Chicago is my favorite city in the U.S. by quite a bit. I love Chicago. It's one of the cleanest cities I've been to, and the people are so kind. Just don't accidentally walk on one of the lower streets. Love Chirac. Not as much as you love being so boring with this tired joke. Yawn. Deleted. What suburb did you come from? This has, I lived in the suburbs, written all over it. Big city scary. You did no such thing. I also love Chicago and came to say this. One of my favorite places to visit. I've been probably 10 times now. Live in Nashville. Anyone who shits on Chicago has never been to Chicago. As an architect, it's one of the most important cities, if not the most important city in our field. You can see the entire history of the skyscraper just walking around the loop. Chicago also has some of the best residential and neighborhood design in the Americas. Can you share the history of skyscraper in Chicago? Is there a walking tour or an essay to learn about this? Walking tour? Oh, my friend. The most common way to tour the architecture is from a riverboat tour. It's so cool and absolutely worth doing if you're ever there. It's seasonal, obviously, though. Absolutely do the boat tour. I live in Chicago and I do that tour at least once a year. It's hands down the best way to see the city. Unless the Dave Matthews Band happens to be in Chicago. https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/Dave_Matthews_Chicago_river_incident that day as well. To echo others, the boat tour is the way to go. But a brief overview is that the first ever skyscraper is pretty widely agreed upon to have been the home insurance building that was built in 1885 and tragically torn down in 1931. It was, however, followed by dozens of early, pre-1900 skyscrapers that remain today. Chicago has by far the best preserved examples of early high-rise architecture in the world. It also contains some of the finest examples of high-rise architecture from every era include
today. Some of the greats from across the ages include the Rookery Building, 1888, the Auditorium Building, 1889, the Monadnock Building, 1891-1893, the Marquette Building, 1895, the Wrigley Building, 1922, the Tribune Tower, 1925, Carbide and Carbon Building, 1929, Merchandise Mart, 1930, Chicago Board of Trade, 1930, Marina City Towers, aka the Corn Cobs, 1967, Klaczynski Federal Buildings, 1960 to 1974, Lake Point Tower, 1968, Hancock Center, 1969, Chase Toe,
R. 1969, Aon Center, 1973, Willis, Sears Tower, 1974, Thompson Center, 1985, Aqua, 2009, Vista Tower, St. Regis, 2020, the tallest building designed by a woman. Chicago has always been and still is a world leader in high-rise design. But what if you don't like architecture? I like Inside Chicago Walking Tours, https://www.insidechicagowalkingtours.com/. I would recommend the Riverboat Architectural Tours, the Chicago Architecture Center, https://www.architecture.org/. has what you were looking for. Can you elaborate on the residential and neighborhood design part? I've never been to Chicago. Are you talking about the suburbs? Or within the Chicago core? Within the core, Oak Park, Wilmette, and a few others are solid, but besides that the burbs are largely sprawl. But the neighborhoods in the city are gridded and oriented around transit, and it hasn't really changed over time. It's just really easy to get around, and it's an excellently preserved example of pre-WW2 American neighborhoods. I'm from Chicago and I know the architecture is famous, but why is it so important, as you say? I don't really understand what you mean by that. Chicago pioneered the skyscraper as we know it today. The home insurance building was the first skyscraper ever built, and Chicago has continued to have huge influence and countless important works in every single decade since, including the 2010s and 2020s. It also had and continues to have some of the most influential architects to ever live practicing within the city and its surrounding areas. It's less dominant today, but in the late 19th, early 20th century, it was the city to practice architecture. Big and famous firms like Studio Gang and Perkins and Wool started and are still headquartered in Chicago. Frank Lloyd Wright, Daniel Burnham, William LeBaron Jenney, Louis Sullivan, and Mies van der Rohe all began practicing in Chicago. Even contemporary players like Zaha Hadid and Jean Gang operated out of Chicago. IIT still has one of the top architecture programs in the world. Greater than you can see the entire history of the skyscraper just walking around the loop. If we only did not get assaulted when trying to do this. Did it in January. Did not get assaulted or even looked at funny. If I was there, you looked funny, trust me. Alright, time to go back to Chicago. I was going to say Chicago, too. It is underrated. I love living in the suburbs and having access to such a great city. I feel like if I bring up any U.S. city at this point, people will be like, but the crime. We've gotten so negative as a country, I can't stand it. Let us enjoy Chicago. Plus, crime rates nationally have been trending downward, so I think PPL just like to make stuff up. Chicago does have poverty and gangs, but this is in residential pockets of poverty, not in the downtown where the restaurants and stores and theaters and bike path and beaches and Buckingham Fountain and the Riverwalk and the Bean S&D Maggie Daly Park and Grant Park and the Sears Tower are located. Longtime Northside resident. Just for argument's sake here, I was trying to bicycle from my apartment in Logan Square to meet some people for lunch outside the Loop. Due to a road closure and some stuff, I accidentally wound up about 3 blocks west of the United Center. Not somewhere you really want to be. All I saw was a family walking to church who kindly told me good morning and a few other people going about their day. I knew someone who lived in East Garfield Park, and while they made it to here, it wasn't safe, they also were never in any real danger. Nothing is really ever as bad as advertised. To be fair, that area around the United Center has been slowly being gentrified over the last 10 years. West Garfield Park is now way sketchier than East, but in general I agree with your sentiment. Nothing is usually as bad as made to seem. The areas that the street gangs run, like WGP, are certainly not safe, but you're pretty unlikely to be bothered if you look like you're just lost and aren't from around there. The gangs have straight-up codes not to mess with white people, people dressed nice who look out of place. The only reasons they're there are their customers or they're lost, and mugging them is bad for business, scares them from coming back and attracts police attention. It's the folks who live there that are too poor to do anything about it that have to suffer the consequences. This is really all too true. Honestly, white or black people who look out of place in those areas are usually bothered by police long before they are bothered by gangs, simply because it's just assumed they are to buy drugs, and this is the entire reason why those areas are that bad. You're never going to solve the drug problem by going after the customer or profiling people and just trying to prevent suspected customers from buying something. It just goes to show how really corrupt and easily bogue the cops are. If they wanted to, they could find enough high-level communication between the gang leaders to RICO them into irrelevancy, just like they did with the mafia by tying the outfit to the 5 families. But that doesn't send enough people to private prison, so U.S. cities are so big and it's easy to avoid the bad parts of town. You have to be alert when traveling anyway. Crime in Chicago is heavily concentrated in the South Side. It is mostly gang-on-gang crime. Downtown Chicago is much safer than downtown Dallas, Houston, or Austin. I saw a video of a clique of convenience store in Chicago that has bulletproof glass room protecting himself. How common is that? Bank in my country doesn't even have that. People that don't visit these cities don't understand how big they are and how isolated the bad areas can be. Like, yeah, Chicago has some neighborhoods that you really don't want to hang out in. But you have to try and end up in them. You're not going to go for a stroll Herald LP and accidentally wander into West Garfield Park on the crime piece. Numbers are down, but that doesn't mean crime is actually down. People feel there's no point in reporting crimes when, even if the police do bother to respond and catch the guy, the prosecutor is just going to let them go with a slap on the wrist. Visited Chicago years ago and thought this as well. Looking for a chance to return and see more of it? I love Chicago. I stayed there for a couple months. The architecture is simply stunning. Shout out to all Chicagoans. You all are literally the friendliest, most engaging people I've ever encountered. When I got back home, in Vancouver at the time, I weirded out people by saying hi in elevators, talking while in lines, etc. It took a few days for Chicago to wear off. As a Chicagoan, that cracks me up. I'm glad our friendliness traveled home with you. 2 reasons. 1. People never factor in population density or other factors into crime statistics. Many places in the U.S. are far more dangerous than Chicago. 2. Far too many tourists go to MI Avenue and Grant Park and call it a day and spend their weekend in a sea of 10,000 other tourists and just are miserable, when if more people would realize that there is so much more to see. Wildly underrated city. I'm from San Diego and I love it, but Chicago is my favorite, over there, city. We visited for a weekend when we were living in Toronto and I can't wait to get back. I moved from San Diego, native, to Chicago. Great to see another San Diegan loving Chicago. Every San Diegan I know who has lived in or visited Chicago loves it. I was going to say the same. Chicago, very underrated and beautiful city. Much prettier than NYC with just about as much to do and far cleaner and infinitely more livable. San Francisco and San Diego are vying for second. I find NYC far more transit-oriented and walkable than Chicago. It's a lot easier to get around cheaply, and walking around NYC is more fun and serendipitous. Chicago is undeniably beautiful, but it is still very car-centric and doesn't have the same global city amenities of NYC. That said, I think Chicago is the most American city in its form, and NYC definitely stands apart from most other U.S. cities in its sheer density. True, though the MTA is way more confusing than the LD used to be pretty even in my mind. In the past 2 administrations of shitty mayors, NYC has become much seedier, dirtier. Sure, Chicago is dangerous but clean. I would also say that the good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods are a little less interspersed than NYC. When I lived on north side of Chicago, I never felt unsafe walking around after hours alone. With NYC, you take a wrong turn and you are in a different world. Question mark, question mark. This is completely untrue, lol. The entire island of Manhattan is essentially Disneyland. NYC has 1/3 of the homicides of Chicago while having triple the population in a smaller area. You have to actively seek out an unsafe neighborhood in New York. You are very unlikely to stumble upon one as a tourist. NYC is statistically much safer than Chicago also. The MTA will obviously be more confusing because it has 28 subway lines compared to Chicago's 8. You are looking at Chicago as a whole. It is a very gentrified city, and if you keep to the good parts, north side, it is extremely safe. Chicago is definitely becoming one of my favorite U.S. cities too. I'm generally more interested in the outdoors, wildlife, etc., but I went with some friends for a baseball trip and had a great time. Anyone who thinks Chicago is a war zone should turn off Fox and actually go there. Areas of the city obviously suck, but every time I've been has been great. Just avoid those areas and you're more than fine. Great food, the architecture is amazing, so much to do, and I was shocked at how clean it was. This is every great city. New Orleans, San Francisco, Los Angeles, NYC. The media blows up the negatives every city has but ignores the greatness of each city. As a tourist, what potential reason could you possibly have to visit the South Side anyways? It's not like it's in the middle of downtown or anything. Some great things about the South Side of Chicago. Frank Lloyd Wright's Roby House, the Museum of Science and Industry, the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, formerly the Oriental Institute, Obama's house, and soon to be Obama Library. It's for the best that those people don't travel to your city then. No one wants close-minded idiots. I'm Aussie and my best mate and I drove from LA to Chicago last year, and spending 4 nights in Chicago was the highlight of our whole trip. That place was amazing. I really like Chicago too. And it's a big, complicated place with a huge range of positives and negatives. Saying, Chicago is wonderful, is like saying, America is wonderful. Which part of America? And for what? I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, first Buffalo Grove, then Spring Grove, way out at the end of the Metro line, at the edge of what we'd refer to as Chicagoland. Chicago's biggest positives are the architecture downtown, the architecture of the homes in the fancier near suburbs, lots of Frank Lloyd Wright and related home design, and the cultural institutions, museums, the Field Museum, the Museum of Science and Industry, the Chicago Children's Museum, the Shedd Aquarium, the Lincoln Zoo, free, the Chicago Botanical Garden, the Lincoln Park Conservatory, the Museum of Surgical Science, and all manner of other places. I could go on and on and on. Then, as with other cities, there are a lot of hardscrabble areas that you would not enjoy visiting or living in. Spent a lot of my childhood in NYC and lived in the area, but Chicago is just a better designed city and I enjoyed my time there. The winter sucks though. I'm deeply entrenched to the East Coast and I wish I could just lift and shift Greater Chicago over here. I'm coming to visit this summer. Recommendations? Please. Came here to say this, Chicago is a fantastic city. Starstruck. It's so in your face in the most amazing way. Ditto. But when I speak to non-Americans, I normally recommend West Coast cities with more diverse climates and scenery. Chicago is the best city in the country, but it'd be way too familiar to someone who has already spent time in London or Melbourne. Chicago over NYC, woozy face. Chicago is absolutely amazing. The food, the architecture, the shopping, the beautiful river going through the city, Lake Michigan. It's amazing. Chicago is absolutely gorgeous. Best city in the summer. Statistically, Chicago is quite safe. People look at absolute crime and not crime per capita. I'd say Chicago also. There's just so much variety, so much incredible food and culture. Respect that opinion, but growing up all along the East Coast of the U.S., Chicago just seemed so each. If Boston is the most like London, Washington, D.C. is the most like Paris, and Miami is the most like Lisbon, I'd say Chicago is the most like Stockholm. Grew up near DC, spent a lot of time in NYC, and lived in Chicago for 5 years. Could not disagree more. Respect that even more then. And that's why traveling around this country is so incredible. Each place has such a unique and singular vibe that is so radically different from the next. Each person experiences it in a different way. Hell yeah, I like you, internet friend. Agree. I grew up close to NYC and been to Chicago. While Chicago has a great skyline and is generally more clean and well organized as a city, everything you can do in Chicago you can do in NYC but better, and also more expensive lol. Not to mention for living in Chicago it's more cold and there's few interesting cities or nature areas nearby besides Lake Michigan. Chicago, when there's no snow. Love Chicago. L. Are you a criminal? S. My favorite city in Sri Lanka is Nuwara Eliya, the coldest city in Sri Lanka. Has anyone ever been to Nuwara Eliya? I am from Canada and have been to Nuwara Eliya many times. It is always nice to have to put on a sweater after so much hot weather where I stay in Tangal. Oh, sounds like you've done a fair bit of traveling here. How long ago did you visit, if you don't mind me asking? I started as a volunteer to build houses in Tangal in 2007. I did 2 more volunteer trips and then lived there for 10 months in 2008-09 to help organize projects. I made many good friends and have returned to visit several times. I was last there to attend a wedding in January of 2023. The organization I volunteered with still goes to build houses every year, and in fact is there with a group now. Yes, I've been there. I liked it. A very nice, friendly and green area. That's great. I should go back there one of these days. I went there quite a long time ago. Yes, there was really something about Nuwara Eliya that I adore. In between 2 chaotic tourist towns, it was nice to be in the calm part for a bit. Also had really good dosa there lol. Awesome. During these days in April, usually it's packed with locals too. I'm glad to hear you had a great time in Sri Lanka. I actually left Sri Lanka a few days ago. Didn't want to leave. I haven't been to Sri Lanka, but I know Nuwara Eliya from the tea. It's my goal to go see the tea plantations in Sri Lanka one day. Nuwara Eliya was the best city in Sri Lanka for me. Canadian here. I'm from Windsor, Ontario. But I'd say visit Quebec City or Montreal, Quebec. They're beautiful, almost as if we have a little piece of Europe in Canada. Definitely worth a visit. I love Quebec City and Montreal. I think QC might be my favorite city in the world and I've traveled a decent amount. One of the few cities we go back to over and over again. It just has a different vibe. The people are very nice, even if you don't speak French. Which I don't. The food is fantastic. So much history and it's just very unique. Plus, there's some incredible nature in close proximity. We go to Taduzik often even though it's like a 10-hour drive. And always go to QC along the Wa. What? Canada has so many great places. The sunset views from many spots in the city, because of its amazing topography, are exquisite. Such a beautiful city. And you don't have to drive 10 hours to get to some other very pretty spots like Charlevoix or some spots on the Gaspésie. Just a lovely region. I was also going to say Quebec City. I'm planning on taking a trip to Quebec City this December. It will be my first time there. Bergen in Norway. It's the second biggest city, but you're always 10 to 15 minutes away from nature, mountains, forests, sea, no matter where you live. I now know about this city because of Conan, so the best part about Bergen is that you can easily escape it. Each. I had the best lobster in my life in Bergen, fresh off the pier. Just that alone makes me want to go back, without even mentioning the scenery. Seconded. Lovely city, great waterfront, surrounding hills terrific to walk, gorgeous buildings. Close to my ideal. At least one truly great hot dog stand too. Bergen is quite fun. Icular. I'm not trolling. Terrible puns, I know. Bergen is amazing though. Such gorgeous hikes minutes from the downtown. Visited last year. I support this answer, although I loved everywhere I went in Norway. Galway. Really loved Galway on my trip to Ireland. Spent time in Dublin and Cork as well. Galway was my favorite. In Ireland, we call it the graveyard of ambition. Because when you come here, you fall in love and give up your dreams to stay. Tears of joy certainly happened to me. My whole family really loved Galway. Although 12-foot waves on the ferry to the Aran Islands did dim that leg of the trip. My fav too. My favorite thing about Galway is that it gives you convenient access to Tuam, where all the action is. This person knows lol, New Orleans. Not Old Orleans? You mean like old Stockholm? Dear old Stockholm. https://youtube.be/1c7dicky_y?mark c=c_5kfipbsh-l3 closing parenthesis you want to hang in the French Quarter. NOLA stands for New Orleans, Louisiana. I like both Orleans. It's such a cool city with a great vibe. Amazing food. Tons of fun stuff to do. It hums with a vibrant energy unlike any other city in the U.S. And it's beautiful. All those colorful houses make me smile. Prerequisite: you must enjoy drinking. This is kind of unrelated, but I have a question for you. I'm Australian, and I was talking only last week with a teacher at my university who has lived between both USA and Australia. I asked about New Orleans as I'm looking to travel in October. He said some really nice things about it, but one thing stuck with me. He said, America has always felt sad for that southern area because of Katrina, but unfortunately everyone will always remember how they turned on each other after. What does that mean? Question mark, question mark, question mark. There was some talk of rampant crime in the aftermath of Katrina. But that was 20 years ago. NOLA, New Orleans, is like a visit to Disneyland, but it is real. There's a bunch of crime, but if you stick to the French Quarter, you will be okay. The food is outrageously good. I just came back and I'm still dreaming about the food, people, music, and art. What an amazing city. Best. Perhaps Granada, though it's a tough competition. Seville, Cordoba, Salamanca, Toledo, Segovia are also amazing. San Sebastian needs to be on that list. I would personally put it first, by the way. I prefer Valencia. More of a mix, old and modern, and it also has a long beach. I loved Granada, Andalusia. I want to go to there. Going to 3 of these soon. Thumbs up. Love them all except Toledo. Granada was incredible. The Sierra Nevada was beautiful and the free tapas was elite. Montreal, Canada. Montreal to live, Quebec City to visit United States. Boston to live. New Orleans to visit Netherlands. Harlem to live, Amsterdam to visit. Agreed on Canada. I said Quebec City, but I'm picturing as a traveler. To live, I'd also pick Montreal. Agree on the U.S. I love Hobart for its quaintness, beautiful river, and great food scene. It's got Port Arthur a day trip away, Bruny Island nearby, and Mount Wellington with spectacular views right there. But I do think Melbourne is the best city to visit in Australia due to the sheer variety of things to do, from sport events, theatre, comedy festival, museums and galleries, plus great food and cafe culture. It also has the Great Ocean Road an hour away. Melbourne is definitely beaten by Sydney, though, when it comes to natural beauty and quality beaches, I would have the same too, but Melbourne definitely gets the nod for me. Hobart is beautiful though and very underrated, close to nature and wine regions, reasonably priced, great day trips and great food. I visited Australia once and I was impressed by the food in Hobart. It was unreal. So good. I may be biased as I was born and raised and still live here after a stint abroad. But yeah, Melbourne is the best. Not as pretty as Sydney, not as friendly as Brisbane or Hobart, but there's just something that sets her apart. Kind of off topic, I love ramen and have eaten it around the world. One of the best ramens I've had was in Hobart at Barwai Izakaya. I love Melbourne though. Just so much to do and eat there. As a Melbourneian, I have to agree. If you're coming from overseas, I think you do need to spend a couple of days in Sydney to see the harbour and possibly the Blue Mountains. Hobart is also great. I spend a lot of time there for work and extend my stay into the weekend whenever we can. But Melbourne is fantastic. My hubby suggested retiring to Brisbane, and again, I spend time there for work, but there's so much, besides family, that would miss in Melbourne. Lviv, Ukraine. A beautiful, well-preserved historic city center. Plenty of culture. Big variety of national food. Rich history. It is also relatively safe to visit at the moment because the city is very far from the front lines, close to the EU-NATO border, and has no significant military infrastructure to be targeted, although you might hear some air alerts. Lviv is awesome. I can't wait to go back when things calm down. Kyiv is also spectacular. Slava Ukraine. Montreal. It has everything. A relatively lower cost of living, on par with Winnipeg, where I live. An amazing food scene. Rich history and culture. Beautiful architecture, and kinda European vibes. Plus a ski hill nearby. If I had to stay in Canada, I would stay in Montreal. As a Kiwi, I have to go by the local saying, you can't beat Wellington on a good day. Yes, your country is absolutely beautiful and you Kiwis are so welcoming. We spent a month traveling across both islands in Wellington, the Botanical Garden, OMG, was definitely one of the highlights. Side note, I also really enjoyed Rotorua and Dunedin.